everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be telling you why you should read The Stone Dance and the Chameleon by Ricardo Pinto. This is a 7-book grim dark series that I have been reading over the past year, I would say. I started it last year and I finished it a few weeks ago. I wanted to let the series kind of sink in my mind a little bit before I filmed my review, and in this video I'm going to tell you why you should read it because it is an absolutely phenomenal series. It's also such a hidden gem. It's criminally underrated, and I need some of you to pick this series up because as lovers of grimdark, you know, I predominantly read grimdark and darker fiction. I know many of you who watch my videos will love this series. It's very unique. I've never read anything quite like it, and I think Ricardo Pinto is a very, very talented author, and I cannot wait to see if he's working on something or what he's working on next, because this series is fantastic. It's fantastic. It hits all the notes, and let me give you a little bit of context before jumping into why you should read it. So this is a Mesoamerican inspired fantasy story, which is not something that you typically see in fantasy, which I loved. There was an original trilogy that Pinto wrote, but then it was rewritten, from what I understand, to be a tighter story, a tighter narrative, and the author decided to split it up into 7 books rather than 3 books. The 7 books are very short. You know, I think the longest book is about 250 pages. The copies that I have very big margins as well, so the books are really short and they read very quickly. I was often able to get through some of the books in 1 or 2 sittings because they're quite easy to get through. But yet the books are quite complex and there's a lot happening. And I think one of the real strengths of this story is the stuff that isn't being said. And I'll come on to that more later on. But there are 7 books, but it's not a big hefty series. You can get through the books pretty quickly if you so wish to. Now, what is this book actually about? And I'm going to keep the plot very vague because I hate it when reviewers maybe unintentionally give away large parts of the plot. I always want to give that choice to you guys to decide whether you want to know tons about the plot. I personally don't actually like knowing lots about plots before I go into reading a book or a series. So I'm just going to literally give you like 1 or 2 sentences. This series is following a world where masters are walking gods in human form. They are tall, they're very pale, and they essentially wear these masks, and their slaves are forbidden from looking at their faces. We are following one main character and then kind of one other main character as well, but he's more of like a side character. He plays a very pivotal role, and we are essentially following him as he uncovers things that are happening in this world. And that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. It's obviously a lot more complex than that. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of different threads, but that's all I'm going to say about this series at this time. Now, the good. What did I love about this series and why do I think you should read it? The writing is fantastic. This series feels very intimate whilst also being very distant. We feel like we are going through this journey with our main character, but there's always this degree of separation, and I think this almost mimics the way the walking gods interact with their slaves, and somehow Pinto also mimics that in his writing. That takes extraordinary skill, and I was super impressed that he was able to do that because it's very, very hard to do, to create that feeling of intimacy whilst also making us feel like we're separate from the story. And I think it really worked for this story given what the plot is and given the themes that it's covering. There's beautiful imagery, the world feels very distinct, and the landscapes feel incredibly rich. I've used this word to describe another book that I filmed a review of recently. It feels very sumptuous, like it feels very detailed. There's a lot kind of happening. There's a lot of detail that if you want to pick up on it, you can, but if you also want to just read over it, you also can. But it's for us people who love good world building. It makes it feel like somewhere you could go and see and take a picture of it, and you know, you'd have the same description if that makes sense. Pinto also uses colour absolutely wonderfully, and I think again he's one of the few authors that has done it as effectively as he has done it. I've never seen or read an author use colour as effectively as he has done it in this series. He's also reinventing existing fantasy tropes. There is also a love story that is very much at the center of this book, but it's not a typical love story. And it gets impacted by the broader problems in the world, and we see the secondary and tertiary consequences of those things, not just on their relationship, but also the other characters as well. And I just think it's so well done. The contrast of the horror and the beauty is also really jarring. And I think, going back to what I said right at the start about it feeling intimate and being distant, Ricardo is able to juxtapose so many different things in such a small amount of time, and he just does it absolutely perfectly, because there is a real sense of horror and terror when you're reading this story, and yet it's very beautifully told, and the world is very beautiful, and we're supposed to believe that these gods are beautiful, and yet it's all just very jarring because there's a mismatch between what is happening and between what we're seeing and what is being told to us through the characters. It works in the best way possible. I can't think of another author that has managed to achieve this type of narrative. Like, it's so unique. And if you do know of any authors that this kind of rings a bell of in your head, please let me know, because I just think it's fantastic, and I think he executes it perfectly. The other thing I really love about the series is the politics. There's a lot of politics in this series. There's politics within politics. There's machinations within machinations. Machiavelli could learn a thing or two from this series. It's just fantastic. It does kind of remind me of the politics in Game of Thrones a little bit. I mean, I've only read the first 3 books, but it does remind me of all the different threads, but it never feels like you have to keep track of it because it's all seamlessly integrated into the world. So you're never really feeling like you have to go back and read a summary or anything like that, because Ricardo does a really good job of reminding us of the stakes and who's involved and what's happening at every given point. The tone of this book is also beautiful, whilst also being extremely brutal. The Chosen, who are the people who wear masks, or the gods who wear masks, they rule through terror, and they're not, shy from doing that. And Pinto doesn't shy from demonstrating that through their actions. And so if you are somebody who doesn't like a lot of violence and a lot of very deeply disturbing, evil behaviour, then this series is definitely not for you. That's definitely a trigger warning there. But as somebody who loves grimdark and dark fantasy, I think he does an absolutely phenomenal job of painting this picture of an incredibly horrific world that nobody would want to live in. No sane person would want to live in. And there were moments where I did get goosebumps when certain scenes happen. There's one scene in particular that happens, I can't remember which book it happens in, but I got goosebumps at how visceral it felt. And it was incredible. It was incredible. The pacing of the books is also really solid. Each book builds on the previous one. Like I said, we are kind of reminded of what happened so that we don't have to go back and forth trying to figure out what we've missed. I do think some of the earlier books are slightly more descriptive and slow, but then what I realised after I finished it was that was very much intentional and needed to be the case in order to be able to execute on this longer game that Pinto has in mind. And it really pays off by the end of the book. The last book is fantastic. It really does justice to the previous books, and it doesn't feel like any word or any sentence or any chapter is wasted, because it all makes sense in the broader context of the world. I say a very similar thing about Baker. I think a lot of people look at Baker's books very individually. I don't think you can do that with his series, and I don't think you can do that with this series. It's very much a continuous narrative. Each book builds on the previous one. In order to be able to really achieve the mastery of this series, you need to read the whole thing, not just the individual books. Fantastic work, absolutely fantastic. I'm going to go on to characters, and I'm going to talk about just 1 or 2 characters, because there's so many characters in this book that I could talk about. And I think, at some point I'd love to do a much bigger deep dive into this series, especially as I would like to reread it at some point as well. And I think maybe I'll do a read along on my Patreon at some point. But our main character, Chameleon, is such a fantastic character, and the growth that he goes through from book 1 to book 7 is incredible. He's a very relatable character, and I think he's one of those characters that doesn't like conflict, but if he has to be a part of it, he will try to find the best solution that he possibly can for all involved. And he's so different from all the other characters, or the majority of the other characters, who are very selfish, all they care about is themselves. They don't care about the people. They don't care about anything but their own needs and desires. Carnelian is the complete antithesis of that. And so it's so interesting to see a character who is so different from the norm, trying to make his way and often failing at it. It's very satisfying to read, but it's also very hard to read at times because you are rooting for him as our main character, and it's very sad and very frustrating, but boy, is it worth it. It's so worth it. It's so satisfying to read him go through the struggle, but then also on occasion come up trumps. And I love that for him. The other character that I'm going to mention is Obsidian. Obsidian is the kind of romantic interest to Carnelian, but he does play a much bigger role than that. And I think Obsidian's character arc is super interesting, and how the world impacts both of these characters in very different ways. We see it almost strengthen Carnelian, but in many ways we see it almost weaken Obsidian. And it's just really interesting to see their dynamics and how their dynamics change from the first book up until the end of the series. And I want to do a video just about these two characters at some point, but like I said, I think I'll do that once I do a reread, because I think their interactions are some of my favourite bits in the series, and I think Obsidian has some of the best dialogue as well, just because of what he has to go through by the end of the book. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the themes. I think there are a few themes that this book tackles very well, and I think the main one is kind of slavery and the human cost of slavery, and what happens when leaders and rulers, whether it's political, religious or whatever, only put their own needs above everybody else. And it really shows the cost of that and the collateral damage. It's very disturbing, and if you're not really in the right frame of mind to read that, I personally would just stay away from this series until you are ready, if you are ever ready for that. But it's a very unfiltered, raw look at that, and I think you're either gonna be okay reading that or you're not, and that's fine. But I think that was kind of the main thing that I kind of took from it. I think the kind of more intimate storyline of the love story between Carnelian and Obsidian is also really fascinating. I want to say why, but I don't want to spoil it, so I won't. I'll hold that off. But I do really like the way that the love story played out. It's not your typical love story. I think if you are somebody who hates romance, this is not a romance in that sense. There is a love story, but it's not your typical love story. It's don't let that put you off or anything like that, because it's about so much more than that. And it's really about how these people have to adapt to an ever-changing world that is very dark and grim and doesn't have a lot of hope. So if you like the sound of that, definitely check it out. I will say one disclaimer is that there isn't tons of magic in this series, not as much as other fantasy series that I've read. I personally don't really care about that. I don't mind reading fantasy without any real magic, just as long as the world itself feels fantastical, which this world absolutely does. It is very, very, very dark, this series. I cannot, mention this enough, because I don't want someone to pick this up if they're not ready for it. There's things like royal incest. There's things like, very, very gruesome scenes, very descriptive scenes of like people dying and conditions that people are living in. And if that's just something that you are averse to, stay away from it, please. Please stay away from it. But I love this series. I think it's such a fantastic series. I think if you like grimdark, dark fantasy, if you like very character-driven stories, if you like really, really sumptuous world building and like really well-paced, really well-thought-out storytelling, then this is the series for you. And I know a lot of you who watch my channel love that stuff. A lot of you have quite similar taste to me, and I think a lot of you would really love it, and I really hope you give it a chance, because it's fantastic. Absolutely amazing. And at some point, maybe not next year, maybe the year after that, I will definitely do a reread, and I think at that point I'll do like a buddy read or something with the channel or with the Patreon. We can all read it together and we can do like deep dive discussions about it, because this is one of those series that needs to be talked about. There's so much nuance that is hard to talk about in a review because I'll spoil things. So anyway, we'll get there at some point. But if there's one thing you have to take away from this, read this series. I think every single book was like a 4 stars and above. And so I think that in itself should give you an indicator of how high quality this series is. And please remember to get the 7-book series rather than the trilogy, because the trilogy is kind of outdated, I guess. The 7-book series is a much more kind of concise formulation of that original trilogy. It's just amazing. Let me know if you've read this series. I have literally met like one person who's read this series, and you know, I don't know anybody else who's read it. Also, the covers on the books are absolutely stunning. They're some of my favorite covers. They look so beautiful on my shelves. So this is definitely one I would recommend buying physically. But yeah, buy it, read it, let me know how you get on, and I'm really curious to see what you all think. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on this series, I will definitely do like individual book reviews as well if there's enough demand for it. Otherwise, I'll hold off until I do my reread. Let me know if you have read it down below. Like I said, I've only met like one person who's read it. I'd be really curious to speak to somebody about it because I've literally been reading it in like an echo chamber. So yeah, I'll see you down in the comments below, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.